Shabbat Shalom. I'm Cantor David Proser of Kempsville Conservative Synagogue, Kehillat Bet HaMidrash in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And this is our Torah portion commentary for the Shabbat of March 27th, 2021, corresponding to the 14th day of the Hebrew month of Nisan in the year 5781. We thank Dr. Ismar Shorsh, Rabbi Joseph Proser, Rabbi Irvin Prize, Rabbi Becky Silverstein, Rabbi Cheryl Peretz, and the United Synagogue Torah Spark series for their various teachings and publications on this week's Parsha. This week's Parsha, Tzav, opens with the divine command of the burnt offering, which leads to the command that a flame be kept burning on the altar in perpetuity. It begins on page 613 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 429 of the Hertz. Parshat Tzav goes on to take the form of a manual for the priests. It includes a more comprehensive and detailed review of the sacrifices that were introduced last week in Parshat Vayikra, and describes the expansion of ritual observance beyond the priesthood, spiritually empowering the Israelite nation with the rudiments of the dietary laws that will be expounded upon later. As we described last week in Rabbi Hertz's commentary on animal sacrifice being the basis of worship in many cultures, we concede that Vayikra's opening chapters sound foreign to modern ears. But we need to look deeper into the differences between the Jewish concept of sacrifice and the image of pagan rituals that we might imagine. Let's start with the fact that the English word sacrifice is not a very good translation of the Hebrew word karban. Sacrifice brings to mind the image of ancient pagans killing animals or even humans to satisfy the hunger of their gods for blood and food. A karban was quite different. With the exception of the olah, the burnt offering, all of the edible meat of the animal offering was eaten by the person bringing the offering and by the kohanim, the priests. The word karban has a root meaning to draw near. The bringing of the offering was an attempt to draw closer to the divine. In other words, God didn't need the smoke of dead animals, but we needed to experience a way to draw closer to God. The noted Torah commentator Rashi asks why it was necessary to command the performance of the burnt offering. The second pasuk of the Parsha reads, Tzav et Aharon v'et banov, command Aharon and his sons. Rashi then answers that unlike other offerings that were shared with the priests and the offerer, the burnt offering was totally consumed on the altar. Therefore, the priests gained no benefit from this offering. So perhaps they would be lax about its performance. Therefore, God phrased it as a command in order to impress upon the priests the great obligation to perform this ritual. The Parsha continues with more laws about burnt offerings, daily meal offerings, laws of the expiatory sin and guilt offerings, as well as offerings of well-being and thanksgiving. And no, in those days it was not a turkey. Expanding ritual responsibility from the priesthood to the general populace, all Israelites are forbidden from eating the fat or blood, even of permitted animals. Again, emphasizing the sacred role of the people Israel as a whole. At God's command, Moshe gathers the entire community of Israel at the entrance of the Ohel Moed, the Mishkan, the tent of meeting. In this manner, Aharon and his sons will be aware that they are serving on behalf of the people, and the people will be aware that the consecration had been done at divine command. Moshe washed Aharon and his sons and dressed them in the prescribed priestly vestments. The Mishkan and altar and all of its accoutrements are anointed with sacred oil, further initiating the regimen of sacrificial worship. The altar is sanctified with a bullock and rams, and the ordination of the Kohanim, the priests, including Aharon the high priest, is signified by the sacrificial blood put on their ears, thumbs, and toes. Through this dramatic ritual, each priest being purified was dedicating his entire being to his sacred endeavor, as well as acknowledging the importance of the human role in divine service. The newly ordained founding priests of Israel are consecrated by the sacrificial blood and the sacred oil sprinkled on them, as was the altar at which they will serve God and his chosen people. The consecration service shows that ordinary materials and ordinary people can be transformed into clay kodesh, instruments for serving God. The installation of Israel's priestly leaders culminates in a week-long process. You shall remain at the entrance to the tent of meeting day and night for 7 days, keeping the Lord's charge, that you may not die, for so I have commanded. The Parsha ends with the confirmation of Aharon's obeying this command. And Aharon and his sons did all the things that the Lord had commanded through Moshe. This week is also the last of the special Shabbatot that precede Pesach. This Shabbat is Shabbat Hagodol, the last Shabbat before Pesach. Why is it called Shabbat Hagodol? Usually we would find 3 reasons that explain any Jewish observance. Reason number 1, it's commanded in the Torah. Reason number 2, historically, such and such was happening in biblical times. The rabbis would often bridge the historical into the biblical. And number 3, Bubby always did it this way. Unfortunately, we can't use the same 3 parameters to explain Shabbat Hagodol, at least not directly, because as far as number 1, there is no additional Torah reading, no special maftir for this Shabbat, although we are going to reference the special Haftorah for this day. For number 2 and number 3, we're going to get there in a roundabout way. Rashi, the dean of Torah commentary, explains that even in his time, people are accustomed to calling this Shabbat Shabbat Hagodol, the great Shabbat or the big Shabbat, but they do not know what makes this Shabbat greater than any other. So, like Rashi, different commentators speak of it and try to explain its origins. In many commentaries, Shabbat Hagodol finds its origin, as does any other special Shabbat, like Shabbat Nachamu, Shabbat Chazon, or Shabbat Shuvah, namely through word association joining the theme of the related event with a quote from the Haftorah of that week. The complete Haftorah reading from the book of Malachi, chapter 4, verses 4 to 24, can be found starting on page 1295 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 1005 of the Hertz. The last verse of this special Haftorah from the book of the prophet Malachi refers to a day in the future which will be Gadol, great. Hine anochi sholeach lochem. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and awesome day of the Lord. That sort of connects number 1, even though it is from the Haftorah, not from the Torah. Let's look at number 2, history. The Tur, Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, 13th century, writes that the Shabbat before Pesach is called Shabbat HaGodol because a great miracle was performed for Israel just before redemption from Egyptian slavery. At God's command on the 10th of Nisan, each family took a lamb, a symbol that was associated with a god of Egypt, and tied it to their doorpost and kept it there 4 days. They told the Egyptians that they would slaughter it on the 14th of Nisan, thus assuring that Israelites would be spared from the destruction of the final plague. The day they took the lamb was a Shabbat. The fact that they were able to keep that lamb out in public and unmolested from the Egyptians itself is a miracle. As a commemoration of that miracle, every year, the last Shabbat before Pesach is designated Shabbat HaGodol. And finally, let's look at our standard reason number 3. Bubby did it this way. Although not specifically the bubbies of our generation, but we might imagine in the shtetl periods of our history, before a formal sermon became part of our weekly service, Shabbat HaGodol became known as one of 2 Shabbatot on which the rabbi would deliver an extensive sermon, the other being Shabbat Shuvah between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. It would usually keep people in shul involved in learning until late in the afternoon in order to hear the teaching expounding on the laws of removing leaven and preparing for Pesach. Due to the length of time in shul, it became known as Shabbat HaGodol, the big Shabbat, or the great Shabbat. So again, with a little stretching, we can apply the same 3 reasons why we do most of what we do. From our KBH family to all of you, a meaningful Shabbat Shalom, a Guten Shabbos, and our best wishes for a Zissen Pesach. Even though this year we may still have to do it in some very unique ways as we did last year. We look forward to the day when we can again appreciate the historical and the humanitarian meaning of Manish Talah Halayla Hazeh. Why is this night different? Rather than focusing on Manish Talah Hashana Hazeh, how was this past year so different? And in addition to L'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim at the end of our Seder, we can surely pray for L'Shana Haba with all of our family and friends back at the Seder table all together in person again. Shabbat Shalom, Good Shabbos, Chag Kasher Sameach. Thank you for watching. Please be sure to subscribe, to like, and to leave comments below.